Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, it's a big honor, big privilege to bring the conversation I had with Sarah Hrdy. Sarah is an anthropologist and primatologist who is professor emerita at the University of California, Davis. She has her PhD in anthropology from Harvard University. She's a former Guggenheim fellow. She's been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the California Academy of Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. She is the author of numerous award-winning books, such as The Woman That Never Evolved, Mother Nature, Mothers and Others, and her most recent, Father Time. It goes without saying she is a pioneer in the field. She has contributed much to anthropology, evolutionary psychology, and her work on motherhood and how we understand mothers from an evolutionary perspective is absolutely consequential. And so it was a really, really big delight for me to get the chance to talk to her. She's very, very kind, very, very wise, and just really wonderful to talk to in conversation. And I really enjoyed her latest book. Reading her past couple of books, on motherhood was incredible, but it was really somewhat of a surprise to read her. Someone that's written about mothers and motherhood about fathers. And while fathers are mentioned in her other books as well, it was really nice to see one book with great data, really good current research on fathers and how we understand fathers in this kind of natural history sort of way from an evolutionary perspective. Really, really just important work that she has in that book and citing many of her own research and other researchers. So I can't recommend the book more highly. We talk about a variety of things. We talk about fathers as caregivers, some of their different roles. We talk about the role of prolactin with male care, decrease of testosterone in new fathers. We spent a good bit of time talking about alloparenting. This is a theme that comes up in all of her work, and so it's really kind of front and center here in the new book. We talk about the grandmother hypothesis a bit, attachment in fathers and what attachment looks like. Many people focus on attachment in mothers, which is supremely important, but it's also important in fathers as well. We talk about fatherhood in the 21st century and how that's continuing to change and to morph and to move in different ways, and many, many other topics. Again, Sarah is really, really such a joy and a pleasure to talk to. She has a great passion for this research and for just trying to understand who we are as humans and how to work and cooperate well together. So her work again is really, really important. And I was lucky enough to have this conversation. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at Converging Dialogues at Substack.com. Also on YouTube, like, subscribe, share. If you like these, if this conversation, we mentioned it here and when we talked, and I've mentioned other places. Many other people I've had on the podcast that talk about similar things or in similar worlds with biology or anthropology or social sciences. So check out some of the past episodes as well, and stay tuned for all the new episodes with wonderful researchers and scientists and guests and great people like Sarah. And now I bring you Sarah Hrdy. I am here with the wonderful, the brilliant Sarah Hrdy. Sarah, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Big honor, big privilege. So I'm very pleased to have you come on.
I appreciate your interest, Xavier. I'm curious to know what you want to know.
Many things, many things. First, you have a fabulous book that's just come out. The book is called Father Time, A Natural History of Men and Babies, out of the wonderful Princeton University Press, which I believe was released earlier this year in 2024. Of course, people will know you for your really groundbreaking work on motherhood. You have Mother Nature, Maternal Instincts, and How They Shape the Human Species. I think this came out in the late 90s. And then,
1991, yeah.
yeah, mid 90s. There you go. And then also Mothers and Others, The Evolutionary Origins of Mutual Understanding. I think just right around 0910 is when this one came out. And so, and you've written obviously many other things as well, but Father Time. So you've written about mothers, and now you're writing about fathers. So that's all wonderful. So we'll get into it. Before we do, just kind of give listeners a snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently still up to.
I'm a primatologist and an evolutionary anthropologist, trained in sociobiology, and lived through those science wars back in the 70s, stressful as they were, where anthropologists, of course, wanted nothing to do with sociobiologists. And somehow, in spite of all that, when the University of California, Davis was interested in hiring my husband at their medical school, just by flying across the country, I went from being an unemployed volunteer at my children's daycare center in Cambridge to being a full professor at the University of California.
Wow.
And did that in 1984. And that was the same year that the big volume on infanticide, comparative and evolutionary perspectives, came out. It was still a little bit controversial then, but over the years it's become much less controversial to argue that infanticide under some circumstances in some species is adaptive rather than pathological behavior. And then I guess in 1990, as more and more reports on infanticide in animals were coming out, and my earlier suggestions were all pretty much validated, I was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, which came as a great surprise because, well, it just did. But it was in 1996 that I decided I needed to just devote more time to writing. And that is when I went into the dean and said, I need to quit. And she said, oh, you can be emeritus. It won't cost us anything because you're half time, so we don't need to pay you medical expenses or your pension. And I thought, great. My early work was controversial. This is a way I could quit with dignity. So I became a professor emerita, though I didn't actually deserve it, at the University of California. And that's what I've been ever since. And together with my husband, Dan, we've been growing walnuts in Northern California, and I've been writing.
Well, very nice. That's a nice arc. There's traces of it. I had a lovely conversation with Rosemary Grant. I'm sure you know Rosemary Grant. And
I just read her book. I loved it.
Oh yeah, her book was really, really nice. We talked about it, and she was great. And she also has these kind of periods of travel, and then what she did after she retired, and how she wrote, and then research and family life. And so it's really cool to see good examples like her and yourself that can just juggle all of it.
There's a lot of similarities between us. And when I was asked years ago for the Leaders in Animal Behavior Volume 2, the first volume was all men, but this one had women in it. And I titled my intellectual autobiography, Myths, Monkeys, and Motherhood, A Compromising Life. And like Rosemary, there were just a lot of compromises along the way to have a family, but also in the face of science really being pretty much a male domain. And Rosemary was a generation just ahead of me. And it was interesting in blurbing her book, I noticed I was the only one that picked up on the fact that in the time it took her to achieve the same kind of accolades as her husband, though their work had been, they worked together all through their life.
Yeah.
And, and then she was elected as well to the National Academy of Sciences. And she began to receive these same awards and be made a professor and so forth. I was the only one that mentioned that it took longer for that to happen than it did for a new species of Galapagos finch to evolve. And come on. But the point is things are changing.
Sure. Yeah.
But I would caution everyone not to take these advances for granted. And when I was writing the preface to the new edition of The Woman That Never Evolved, that Woman That Never Evolved was published in 1981, and it was about how primatology and evolutionary anthropology had been so androcentric, and we needed to consider selection pressure on females as well as males. It wasn't that sexual selection theory was wrong. It's just it left out a lot of things females were doing. And writing that preface, the last paragraph, is about a conversation with my daughters, telling them not to take anything for granted. Sweeties, you think you have reproductive choices now. This was 1999, and we took them for granted. But you know what? They may not be as scot-free. They may not be there when you want them. And of course, the backlash right now is what we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting. It's nice that people have been taking more of an eye on, it is or it was historically male dominated, but you have other writers like yourself, like Rosemary. I also think of Richard Prum, the ornithologist, has written about this as well in sexual selection. He's done some good work, and so it's nice to see that we can focus a little bit on how natural and sexual selection work with females. And much of your work, I guess it's interesting that you're mentioning this because much of your work, Mother Nature, as I mentioned earlier, you really wrote a lot about motherhood from an evolutionary perspective, which is, again, it's just is invaluable work that you've done on that. But all that to say, you've written this book on fathers and and men and babies and how they interact. And it's as I was rereading your earlier books, past couple of weeks, I could see a lot of that was in those books as well. And then it's just kind of full front and center with the new one, Father Time. So I guess what inspired you to kind of turn your attention to writing about the role of fathers?
Each of those books led to the other. It was writing Mother Nature that, I realized, oh my goodness, an ape with the life history characteristics of Homo sapiens with such costly offspring, such slow maturing offspring, years before they were going to be nutritionally independent. And all the while, babies getting costlier, and we knew that birth spacings were getting shorter. Mothers were weaning earlier. This is just so paradoxical. It doesn't make sense. How could it be unless mothers had a lot of help? And of course, the old idea was, okay, there was man the hunter, and he was helping his mate in exchange for her giving him certainty of paternity. But then along come, O'Connell and Hawkes and Blurton Jones and Richard Lee, and they're saying, wait a minute, a man all by himself couldn't really bring in enough to meet the terms of that sex contract. It took more than that. It took alloparents as well as parents to keep those children alive. And so by the time I finished Mother Nature, I was arguing that our ancestors, like maybe 9 to 10% of the thousands of 10,000 or so bird species and social insects, but maybe only 5% of mammals. 5% of 5,400 species of mammals are cooperative breeders, where alloparents, group members other than the parents, males and females other than the parents, are helping to rear offspring. And writing that, I realized, well, wait a minute, who are these alloparents? Who are they? Why are they doing this? And what are the environmental conditions that force this on our ancestors? And that's when I wrote Mothers and Others, The Evolutionary Origins of Mutual Understanding. But in writing that book, I realized, oh, there are implications for infants of being raised this way, having to depend on handouts and help, having to ingratiate themselves with multiple others, and seeing there sort of the origins of our potential to mind read and be interested in what others were thinking, to care about reputations. These were the building blocks of cooperation. And cooperation would be absolutely the critical thing for the quote human success story. Um, and that was fine. And then I started to notice, it was about the time my first grandchild was born, but never mind, that men were getting much more involved with babies than I had ever realized should happen. It wasn't happening in other apes. And how on Darwin's earth, it wasn't just that they were helping. Men who were in direct contact with babies, primary caretakers right from birth, some of these gay fathers who have contracted with a surrogate mother and right from birth, they're caring for that baby. Ruth Feldman and Eyal Abraham in their lab in Israel were showing that their brain responses were very similar to those of a mother. And I already knew that men spending a long time in intimate proximity to infants, I knew that testosterone goes down and prolactin goes up. We knew that for marmosets. We learned that for marmosets from Alan Dixon's work back in 1980. Why it took 20 years to look to see if something like that happened in humans is a story in and of itself about science. We only see what we expect to see. We only ask the questions that we're already thinking okay, that's science's problem, but we get around it. Diversity of personnel. A lot of this work was done by mothers and women who knew how costly babies were, who were interested in the question, how do you tell a man is going to help and a man is not going to help? Those are vital questions for a woman to know if they're going to have children. But once we started looking, this material was coming in, and I realized we have sold men short. Darwin's definition of man's unfortunate birthright as being competitive and based on rivalries with other men and leading him to selfishness and unfortunate. Well, wait a minute. Men also do have this nurturing potential. It's just not ordinarily expressed. It's been latent there, stashed away in Mother Nature's cupboard all these years. How long? Well, that was the part that made Father Time so hard to write. It nearly killed me, Xavier.
Wow.
I would wake up in the night with, can this possibly be right, with headaches? But anyway, as that book was going to press, the manuscript was out of my hands. A colleague in Uruguay sent me a preprint of an essay by a brilliant Japanese neuroscientist named Kumi Kuroda, who was arguing pretty much the same thing, except, of course, neuroscientists don't really write in English. They write in these acronyms. But she was basically, and here's the story, is that, if you look back in time, we all, of course, descend from creatures who lived in a watery world, from fish, creatures like amphibians and fish. And Darwin knew this. And back in the 1870s, maybe even earlier, he was hypothesizing that our ancestors had had gills and swim bladders and had been hermaphrodites like some fish are. But then he set that aside and his Victorian preconceptions kind of took over, and sexual selection theory made him focus on male-male competition for mates and females doing other things, rearing their babies. Okay. But he guessed at this, set it aside, but I think his idea was actually right. And in the neural legacies of mammals today are these ancient vertebrate potentials for caretaking. And when you look at fish today, extant fish, there are 28,000 species of fish. Not many of them, maybe a quarter of those, have any parental care at all. But those that have parental care, it's mostly male care. It's the males protecting the eggs and the fry. Well, those same neuropeptides, those same hormones, prolactin, a hormone that really regulates water balance in fish, turned out to be incredibly important for paternal care in fish and looking out for these things. And the same neuropeptide, or its homologue, oxytocin, that in mammals becomes oxytocin, is there. And it is playing a kind of similar role in building up these in humans, this affiliative potentials, making you feel safe and making you feel comfortable. Well, these males were feeling safe in their territory. They were defending the eggs that were laid there, fanning them with their tails, and of course, in extreme cases, gobbling them up in their mouths, but never swallowing to keep the eggs safe until they could mature into little fish fry and swim off. And then we get into the sea dragons and the pipefish and I'm forgetting the seahorses. Mm-hmm. And there the pregnancy is happening. Well, I mean, we have to call it pregnancy. The female injects the eggs inside the male. He fertilizes them there. He's washing them with kind of the equivalent of an amniotic fluid, which provides the right oxygen balance and the right nutrition for those little fry to develop until they just spray out of his mouth one day into the very dangerous ocean where most of them will be eaten, but not all. And, this is our heritage. There has always been a nurturing potential in men, but it took very special conditions for it to be expressed. And these were really, I think, have to be thought of as cultural and historical factors leading to the situation we're in the 21st century, where women are working more and men are helping more with babies. This is new. This really men haven't been in intimate proximity to babies from birth ever before in the history of mammals.
I guess the question I have here on this is there is potentially is of sorts of maybe a latent kind of quality here about the nurturing capacity of fathers. So there's this ability of there is let's say a latent capacity. But I guess the question here is there something more manifest where we're going to see qualitatively, or we're going to have better experiences if we see fathers and mothers rearing offspring in a better way? Maybe we see this with other primates. We see this maybe with certain birds, and obviously with us and these cooperative species. Maybe we can see some of this as well with dolphins or orcas, all these big social cooperative animals.
Absolutely, yeah. Those are good examples.
So there's the capacity. Yes, we there's the ability if needed, but is it if we're seeing here that we can see better experiences, or that we're seeing something that there's a functionality to it when fathers are involved? What's the story there?
I worry about those same questions. I ask those same questions. I think it's possible. I loved Kendrick Lamar's rap. It just happened to have the same title as my book, Father Time. But he's kind of lamenting these definitions of masculinity that we've imposed on men. You have to be strong and silent, and you can't express too much emotion or concern. And I'm wondering, wait a minute, have these definitions of masculinity done men many favors? Has the idea that man's role is to be the breadwinner, which in many environments is kind of a contract with his mate that he can't fulfill because those kinds of jobs aren't available. Is this really doing men a favor? And you look at this work Ann Case and Angus Deacon's recent study about deaths of despair,
Yep.
where 3 of 5 deaths in America are due to men dying from overdoses or suicide. This is a level of men not being well served by the roles being offered to them in the 21st century.
Mm.
And I was just reading in the Wall Street Journal, I clipped it out yesterday, this article, nursing field is attracting more men. And in the last 10 years, there's been this surge of men into nursing. And, they're leaving fields like welding because they say, these jobs are going to be taken over by robots. I think I'll do something different and something more satisfying to me with the kind of interactions that I want to have. So I think we may see more of that, but it all depends on what's going on in the society at large, in context. I mean, if there's another war, just forget men having more role in caring for their children and being able to develop this side of their nature. But I think it's important to recognize that man's nature does contain more different potentials than we had given them credit for having. And this came as a surprise to me as a committed Darwinian and sociobiologist. This was hard to wrap my brain around. But the evidence was just there. And, I agree. I don't know where this is leading. And I don't know if it will continue. And for it to have anything like an evolutionary impact, I mean, we're talking about something that could happen, but not something that's likely.
I can hear the counter arguments to this of, well, we know, that, all of the things we've been told for, hundreds of years, that, men are protectors and they go and they hunt and they kill and they this and that. They don't do all these things that females have typically done and things like that. And it does seem a bit one-dimensional. And obviously there's the history of science that's along there as well with some of the people's priors of how they're looking at things. But that's why I think that the work you do in the book and what many researchers are doing is trying to look at the more complex, multidimensional components of females and for males, of saying like, wait, with fathers, maybe they're, maybe this is, maybe the default mode is, maternal care, and there's still a very good function for mothers to do that for obvious reasons. But that does not mean that fathers that they always have a sidelined role, that it's just a different role of sorts, and that there is a lot of complexity to it.
There's a lot of recent history and technological innovation involved here. I mean, we've had baby bottles have been around for thousands of years, little clay pots with spouts on them and so forth, but rubber nippled baby bottles didn't come around till the end of the 19th century, and pasteurized milk, that helped. And then by the end of the 20th century, we have quite sophisticated baby formulas. And even though I think pediatricians still recommend breastfeeding for its immunological properties and also the emotional benefits for an infant in that closeness, it's simply the case that babies today can grow up, thrive. I mean, in developed societies, 98 to 99% of them are surviving, and most of them are not any longer being breastfed or breastfed that long. So we have this option, which was never there before in the last 225 years that mammals have been, 225 million years that mammals have been around. But what would be optimal is hard to know. And of course, this could keep going in these strange, innovative directions so that we have AI robots raising our babies, which I have to think of as being a really bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, that's not. I don't think that's something we should be shooting for. Let me ask. I guess here, just a little bit specifically. We've mentioned it, so I'm curious here. Maybe you can expand on this a bit. Is we see in primate relatives, prolactin care. You can kind of just give us the cliff notes of that. And you saw that in marmosets and tamarins. This increase in prolactin in males, what does that tell us? Whatever we know about that, and also this kind of role that kind of natural sexual selection could be playing here with male care.
So, this very multifaceted hormone, prolactin, its earliest functions, as far as we know, had to do with water balance in
Hmm.
fish and
Yep.
maintaining that. But it becomes, of course, very involved in lactation
Mm.
and in making milk, releasing milk. And its word, prolactin, prolactation, was, of course, first identified there. But now that we know that it rises in men as well when they're caring for babies, we need to look a little bit more broadly at some of the implications of this hormone. And one of them in mothers is lactational aggression, which is a mother just after she's given birth and is beginning to lactate is incredibly aggressive. Why?
Mm.
To defend her baby against predators, of course, but also conspecifics. And in primates, females are very feisty, and anyone knows that if you can have a very nice dog who might bite somebody just after she's given birth, who comes in and is just a little bit careless, sticking your hand right into where her pups are, you're going to get your hand bitten, and it's your fault for not knowing, and being more considerate of her concerns. And some Italian psychiatrists back in the 90s proposed that postpartum depression was actually it was around that time that some psychologists, I know Steve Pinker was thinking this way, was that postpartum depression was because these are women who, lacking social support when they gave birth, would have wanted to eliminate their baby right then and get on with their life because it wasn't going to be successful operation rearing that child. But the problem is infanticide among our hunter-gatherer ancestors, where births were probably pretty widely spaced and so forth. Um, you know, we don't have good estimates, but for African hunter-gatherers, the best estimate we have for maternal neonaticide, a mother just right at birth terminating, is about 1 in 100.
Mm.
And postpartum depression is, I don't know, 1 in 8, 1 in 10.
Yeah.
Postpartum blues is closer to 60-80% is, weakness after birth. But real depression is, so the numbers don't match up. So the psychiatrists in Italy were suggesting that, well, maybe what it was the surge in prolactin producing in mothers this hostility and this aggression. And, in many societies, most I would argue, certainly in developed Western societies and also most Asian societies, for a woman to be hostile and aggressive to others is not appropriate behavior for a woman. So she's having unacceptable emotions in and of itself. And she also perhaps is recognizing that she's not going to have all the help she needs rearing her babies. But it's a complex phenomena. There's got to be not just, it's like autism. There's not one kind of postpartum depression with one cause. And a really interesting master's thesis done by a young woman whose name kind of escapes me at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, working among the Hadza, is finding surprisingly high levels of postpartum depression among these hunter-gatherer women. And whether or not this is traditional or not is hard to say because the Hadza are under tremendous pressure from outside. There are these very wealthy Middle Eastern groups trying to take over their territory for hunting parks, and all these tourists coming in, and life changing, and cell phones coming in. It's a lot of stress. However, these women have lower infant mortality rates than would have been the case back in the Pleistocene. I think the infant mortality rates are very high by Western standards. They're around 25%, but they're not nearly as high as 50%, which would characterize their aunt. So I don't know what is causing these reports of postpartum depression among 21st century hunter-gatherer women. I don't know.
It's an interesting story, and obviously, a lot of the process of it is a little bit unclear. Obviously, you mentioned in the book is you talk about the involvement of testosterone in mothers and fathers, and so I think there's some bit of knowledge that people know a little bit now. Maybe you can chat about it and what your ideas are on it, of how after for new fathers there is a decline in testosterone.
Very marked. It
Yeah,
doesn't last, but
what's
it's
this
very marked.
about? Yeah, what's this about?
Yeah.
What's
Oh,
the thing
that's
here?
a wonderful story, and it really started. And I focus on them in the early chapters of the book. These two women in Canada, Anne Story and Catherine Wynne Edwards, who, unable to get funding to do the work they wanted to do in rodents with biparental care, got funding to do a very tiny grant, like $10,000 or something, to do this work in humans. And one of their graduate students was pregnant, and she was in a Lamaze class. So they got all the people in the Lamaze class. These are already highly motivated fathers because they were in a Lamaze class with their wife.
Yeah.
And they got them to participate in this study. And sure enough, just like in the marmosets, prolactin went up in the men exposed to babies and baby smells. In one case, they're holding little dolls with used baby blankets, but they're watching a baby struggling to get on the nipple in a film, and you expose these men to babies, and sure enough, they're primed, and their prolactin goes up, and their testosterone goes down. And then this group at Northwestern follows up on that. And there was a nutritional study in Cebu in the Philippines where they had been studying men right from birth, right through adolescence, into their first marriage. Well, these data were available. And Chris Kuzawa and Tom McDade, and the first author on this extraordinary paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, was Lee Gettler, a graduate student on that project. And this was really the gold standard study, Xavier, of showing that testosterone goes down in new fathers, because an obvious question was, well, maybe men with lower testosterone are more likely to settle down and become fathers. And so, no. In fact, men with higher testosterone were slightly more likely to get married. But then after the birth of their first child, it went down. And Lee has been measuring his own testosterone for years. And this whole story about fathers, so much of it is scientists studying themselves first. We became the proof of concept. The testosterone study is lovely, and there is actually a very plausible evolutionary explanation for what's going on. It's called the Wingfield hypothesis, named after John Wingfield, an endocrinologist, neuroscientist, ornithologist here at Davis. And what John Wingfield proposed, that was originally studying birds under stressful conditions like bad weather and so forth, but also finding that during the mating season, when males are challenged by other males, their testosterone goes up. And then during the breeding season, when they're helping their mates build the nests and protect the chicks, even feeding the chicks, their testosterone goes down. And this pattern is being repeated in humans in studies now. I think the Gettler study has been replicated, quite a few times. And these women in Canada were right. And they really kind of opened the floodgates for this kind of work. And it was women asking questions basically about their own situation. They wanted to find out which men are likely to help and which men aren't, which males are likely to help and which aren't, and what are the impacts for both sexes. And then, of course, there's the question that this concerned me most in Mothers and Others is what are the implications for infants?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the real question here because I mean, we'll come on to attachment and stuff in a bit, but I mean, yeah, I mean, what's that look like for infants and for humans in that first year, 2 years of life? Is I mean, obviously, it sets the whole foundation for much of humans. I want to. I'm glad you brought up alloparenting because obviously it's in all of your books and it's certainly here in the new one. Real quick, you mentioned this is sort of something that's become interesting. So, I mean, I had heard about it, but I first read it in like really expansively in um, Nicola Rehani. She wrote a great book called The Social Instinct. I think that's right. I could be forgetting the title. Um, she's lovely. She's wonderful. She's brilliant. And she talks about this grandmother hypothesis, right? Which
Yeah,
is which
this is really,
becomes very fascinating to me. And I did some digging. I've since talked about it a little bit, and I had this wonderful conversation with a historian called Susan Mattern. Susan is down in Georgia, I believe, and she wrote this book
about
called
menopause.
Yes, about menopause, Slow Moon
Yeah,
Climbs. There it is. I think that's right.
yeah. She's a
And we had a
historian. Yeah,
yeah, we had a great conversation. She has a whole long chapter on the grandmother hypothesis, and I've read about it. More recently, people have some ideas. Kat Bohannon wrote a great book called Eve. She talks about it a little bit. Anyways, so people have been thinking and talking about this. I guess for you, in the context of, we can say grandparents, other extended family members, and then obviously with fathers in that context, this idea of alloparenting, of how people we think of mothers as being primary and things like that. Okay, and that's not true, but that you do need, because I think part of it is as being social mammals, you have to have this sort of alloparenting. How do you see? I mean, you can talk about grandmother hypothesis or your ideas about that. I'd be curious, but how do you see this? The way fathers are also kind of maybe within that grouping, at the least, maybe even more extensively in terms of alloparenting.
well, in traditional contexts, even a society like the Aka, Central African Origins, which have the highest incidence of male care reported anywhere in the world, where men are spending, you know, hours every day in close proximity to infants, they're really only in direct contact with them and holding them maybe, I don't know, 5% of the time. It's not a whole lot of care. But I think there is a role for fathers, of course, with older children, and for grandfathers in kind of creating their role in creating communities that are alloparentally benign.
Mm,
And they, there's evidence from hunter gatherers that ethnographers like Polly Wiesner talk about the role of grandfathers in encouraging kin to come to their group and to spend time there and to make it a kind of harmonious place, a place where good alloparenting can happen. So that's all fine. I think that there is a role for grandfathers as well. But I think the grandmother hypothesis is really, I think it's holding up really pretty well. And I had known for years that in non-human primates like baboons
mm,
and chimps and the langur monkeys that I studied, older females, as they're, in monkeys getting to be around 30 years old, in chimpanzees closer to 50, they're less fertile, and their reproductive value is declining. But and Dan and I wrote a paper about this in Science back in 1976 about the very strange dominance relations or hierarchies found in langur monkeys, that females rise in rank as their reproductive value is increasing, and they're at the top of the hierarchy right when they're most fertile and reproducing the best. And then as they decline, they fall in rank. But these incredibly low ranking females spend all their time on the outskirts of the group, avoiding competition with anybody else. If an outsider comes in or there's an infanticidal male, these are the females that, just like Boadicea, I mean, they're just rushing in, arthritic old females taking on this warrior role to defend infants. It's a level of altruism that is just staggering. Okay, I knew that was there. But then in 1989, Kristen Hawkes and James O'Connell and Nick Blurton-Jones reported that among hunter-gatherers, the females who were working the longest hours, gathering the most calories from plant foods like these underground starchy tubers that you have to dig out. It's very arduous labor. And there's a wonderful picture that they took of a 70-year-old Hadza woman moving this enormous boulder to get at the tubers underneath. And these were the women working the hardest. The mothers with new babies were kind of hindered by that. They were working less. The youngsters were, it's not easy to get child labor out of your kids. And they weren't necessarily. It was the older women, the great aunts and the grandmothers. And so in 1998, Hawkes, O'Connell, and Blurton-Jones, and I think Eric Charnoff was in there, and some others, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And actually, at the time, there was a lot of resistance to the publication of that paper. But I actually was the editor of that paper. And I said, no, you have to publish this because I think it's right. and I still think it's right. And since then, much more has come in that, there is something like the ovaries of an older female chimpanzees kind of peter out.
Right.
And they have menopause too. People kind of think the menopause hypothesis, the grandmother hypothesis means why we have menopause. No, menopause is built in. The grandmother hypothesis, as Hawkes designed it, is this is why women were selected to go on living so long after menopause. And she and I differ slightly in that she really focuses, she's zeroing in on grandmothers, which is important to do when you're introducing a new idea. But I actually am looking at allo mothers and allo parents more generally.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I think there's many of the things with the grandmother hypothesis. I think obviously Nicola's work is on cooperation. She talks a lot about interdependence, and one of the interesting things about her book, which makes it great, is she does talk about that dark side of cooperation, right? That there is, cooperation is a good thing in a lot of ways, but people also, primates and humans, we cooperate together to do also negative things to people, as other people as well. So it's an interesting thing there. But it's this idea of, there is an element of older females helping younger offspring cooperate, but also that there's this imparting of wisdom, kind of with, I think this was with elephants and orcas of, trying to be the ones leading things and saying, hey, we've been here before, we know how to do this. It seems to be that way. Again, I don't think it's super conclusive, but that there is still a really important need. And so I think it's really nice how you put it in your book of this context of how do older adult members help flexibly, kind of activate through this kind of responsive caregiving and responsibility and commitment to, other generations of offspring. I think it really shows, I think that the essential part that older folks can play in society, and that it's not just, your reproductive value is gone now, and so now I think there is still something essential about this kind of alloparenting within a community. I think that's really important.
I think it's been very meaningful to a lot of a lot of older women. Yes, I agree.
Mm,
And very helpful for children.
mm.
We're still working on the role of grandfathers, but we'll get there. I think
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm focused on something you said earlier.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
you're talking about the hypothesis that cooperation, its dark side,
Mm-hmm.
evolved so that we could outcompete other groups.
Mm, mm,
And I think cooperation was encouraged and enlisted often for that goal. But the capacities to cooperate, I actually think we have to go back to a different beginning.
mm,
Because when you look at the evidence from developmental psychology, how early these capacities are emerging to, toddlers rushing to pick up something someone else has dropped, how desperately they want to ingratiate themselves with others. And
mm,
they want to be liked and approved of. They feel shame when they're disapproved of, pride when they're approved of.
mm,
Well, where does this come from?
mm,
Well, I think that comes from little infants needing to elicit care, not just from mothers who may have other children on their mind,
mm,
but from allo mothers as well. And it happened really early in our evolutionary history. So, when you look at these hypotheses that are rampant in evolutionary anthropology about the origins of cooperation, that we evolved to band together with other men so that we could wipe out the group next door, or we evolved to bond with other men so that we could hunt and so forth. Well, wait a minute. Chimpanzees like to eat meat too.
mm,
Chimpanzees are fighting with other groups too. Why
mm,
didn't they evolve
mm,
cooperative capacities like we have? They would surely benefit
mhm,
from having them. And why do you see these so early? And
mm,
why in both sexes?
mm,
So that's why I go back to shared care as being the kind of what do you call it in venture capitals? Where you're seeding new ideas, you're cooking the cooking pot for new ideas, whatever the word is.
Yeah.
This is where the neural networks first get laid down for
Mm,
being able to mentalize what someone else needs, caring what they think,
mm,
caring what they think about you. And I think these are really critical first steps to cooperation.
mm,
And yes, these capacities get refined
mm,
later on.
mm,
But as we go further back in time, there's a lot of debate among this right now in paleontologists. I was just at a conference in Paris, and a lot of paleontologists are saying, well, none of this stuff really gets started until maybe 400,000 years ago. And with Homo heidelbergensis,
mhm,
emerged from Homo erectus. And I should caution you that in my own work, because I am trying to reach out to a little bit wider audience than I might normally reach, I just lump all Homo erectus together. I don't distinguish
mhm,
ergata and heidelbergensis, a Homo erectus, as
mhm, mhm,
this footloose, highly variable ancestor,
mhm,
6 feet tall in some places, 4 feet tall, some, and
mhm.
very adaptable.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe it's many different species, maybe it's one species. It's kind of, from my point of view, interested in the evolution of parental care. Maybe not that important.
Mm,
But there's some suggestion. I know Zerai Alimsagad and Jeremy De Silva
yep.
and um, Phil. I'm forgetting their names. These paleontologists. I should know them, but I can't remember them right now.
Mhm,
Alimsagad um, are looking at Holly Smith's work and other work, looking at the teeth rings
mhm,
of a 2.5-year-old or 3-year-old Australopithecine
mhm,
3-4 million years ago.
mhm,
And they're already showing signs that by maybe as early as 6 months, this little one was already starting to eat some food other than mother's milk. well, where's that coming from? And so there's some suggestion that shared care may be very early. Well, in Mothers and Others, I figured I was already sticking my neck out by
Mhm.
putting out this stuff about cooperative breeding. So I said 1.7 million years ago, but now even that has gone back. The Pleistocene is now thought to begin 2.6 million years ago,
Mm.
from 2.6 million years ago to 12,000. So anyway, I think we're going to be pushing cooperative breeding back, but this is controversial, and
Mm.
others want to see it much more recently. I know my colleague Mike Tomasello is much more
Mm.
interested in the last 400,000 years.
Yeah.
And the dating is just always really tough.
Mm. Mm. But even if it is earlier, it's not only the fact that it's earlier; it's that cooperative breeding is happening where potentially fathers have a more maybe potentially active role. Again, hard to say, but maybe that was what was going on. Is that kind of the claim here that earlier, and then also that fathers maybe were more active than was thought before?
Well, yes, but let's remember, and this again is going back to work of the ethnographers like
Hmm.
Kristen Hawkes and Blurton Jones and paleontologists like O'Connell, who were saying a man by himself, and there's just going to be one father. We're human. We're not marmosets where there can be more than one father.
Hmm.
So just one father uh, is unlikely to be able to bring in enough meat to support his kids by himself. And he himself, to stay fed, is depending on plant foods shared with him by women and with meat brought in by other hunters who were luckier than him that day. Their data from the Hadza, which, I mean, let's be clear, they're living in the Serengeti,
Hmm.
which back in the last century was, a very game rich area. It's absolutely ideal habitat for
Hmm.
a hunter to live in. And they're going out every day and, or maybe many times a week, and only coming back with significant prey, maybe 1 or 2 days in a month. Well, that wasn't going to cut it for babies that need to eat regularly every day. So the men themselves were having to depend on others. It was their insurance against starvation.
Hmm.
And this is it's a hypothesis that's been proposed before, but I associate it with Mike Tomasello because he gave it this name, the interdependence hypothesis or the
Hmm.
mutualism hypothesis,
Hmm.
that in the Pleistocene, our ancestors really had to depend on others. And I agree. Food sharing was huge. And, if you go back to thinking about grandmothers, what did I just tell you about langurs and other primates where old females are very altruistic?
Hmm.
But they don't go on living longer after menopause. They die shortly after. They
Yeah.
hit menopause and they die in a year or so. Okay. Humans go on living longer. Why was that? Well, where we differed from those others was that there was something useful those old women could do on a quotidian basis every day.
Hmm.
They could help sustain their offspring and lovely work. Nancy Howells and others have done this work showing that, children with a lot of kin among people like the coon, and I think that the Hawks group has done similar work with the Hadza, that children with grandmothers lose less body fat during times of shortage. I mean, let's be clear, everybody is pretty much hungry all the time.
Right.
Occasionally there's a bonanza of meat and things and people get well fed, but everyone is thinking about food, which makes it so moving and startling that people are so eager to be generous. And
Hmm.
the ethnographer Lorna Marshall tells a story that just haunts me. It's so beautiful about this old woman, and she has a piece of meat, and she's passing it around, and everybody takes a tiny bit. These are hungry people, and they love meat. It's this. The fattier, the better. It's just great. And everyone takes a tiny bit, and it comes back to her, and there's nothing left. And she doesn't mind. And she is building up that social capital of being generous.
Mm.
And this is, I think, what got left out of so much of our theories about human evolution. Back in 1871, when Darwin got around to talking about human evolution, in 1859, with The Origin of Species, he says, I'm going to show how evolution happens, but I'll leave humans for later. So later comes in 1871 when he writes Sexual Selection and the Descent of Man. Right there, he's showing you his bias. He thinks that we were sexually selected, males competing with other males for access to females. But there was something he left out, and it's not an idea he didn't know about, but I also didn't know about it until much later when it was brought to my attention by the wonderful, the brilliant evolutionary theorist, Mary Jane West Eberhard, an entomologist, but also wonderful theorist.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't fully understand her work and why it would be so important to me, trying to understand these little babies competing with other babies, even babies they couldn't see or hadn't been born yet, for maternal and allomaternal attention. I didn't understand it then until my colleague and good friend, Randolph Nesse, kind of the father of evolutionary medicine and evolutionary psychiatry, was telling me about his clinical practice. And he was dealing with people who felt so bad because they were afraid someone else would disapprove of them, wouldn't want them as a partner, wouldn't want them as a child. And it just dawned on me, oh yes, these infants back then, what they wanted desperately was to ingratiate themselves with someone else, be chosen as a recipient of this care that they needed so desperately. So social selection it just revolutionized the way I thought about human evolution. And it's not that sexual selection ever goes away. I'm sorry, we're apes after all. It's there. But social selection in some contexts can override it. When men's status depends on their reputation and what others think of them, where generosity and being a good citizen becomes important, where becoming a good father is important, men compete with other men to be good fathers. And it's not necessarily expressed like competition, but if you look at it closely, something like that is going on. It's the same drives that men want to be respected.
Yeah, well, this goes back to the conversation about cooperation. I mean, I think some of the uniqueness with humans maybe is that we're forming coalitions. We're looking for, power and status in social networks. We're looking for how we can have alliances. Obviously, friendship is really important as well. And there's a lot of different things with cooperation there. I mean, again, Nicholas talked about this. Joe Henrichs talked about this. This whole idea of how we understand what is. I mean, other primates cooperate, and in other animals cooperate. So we see that in, I think, nature. I think we see that in the world. But there is some kind of unique ways in which humans do it, which doesn't make us necessarily better. And again, there are other ways of how cooperation turns out. But I mean, I think there are some unique ways, which is interesting when you start from family and then, kind of you go outside a little bit more into the community and then larger. And then now we're cooperating between species. It becomes a much bigger story, and it's really, really interesting. I have two final questions for you. One is, obviously it's a big topic, so we don't have to get all into it, but you write about it in all of your books, including the recent one, about attachment. And obviously we talked about the work of, there's, Bowlby and Ainsworth and all that in the 60s and 70s about attachment theory, and it's used in the clinical world as well. It's great for that. I guess, how do you see, usually, what was the idea of attachment is this internal working model. We need contact comfort. This is Harlow's work. We have pre-attachment, attachment in the making, full-blown attachment, all these things. And usually attachment is really important that first year and a half of life. I think months 5 to 9 or 7 to 9 months of the first year is really important. And a lot of the times, you can even look at I don't know if you know of I think he's an analyst and a neuroscientist as well. As Alan Shore has done some really great work on the connection with mothers and attachment. But I guess here, I mean, you can talk about that a bit, but I guess here, where do we see there's been some work on this, on the role of attachment with fathers and infants, or fathers and young children, and how that's also particularly instructive as well. What is your ideas here with attachment and fathers?
Well, until recently, where you had men caring for babies right from birth, you had fathers in the role of helping
Mm,
the mother.
hmm
And it's interesting that the part of their brains, this is going back to the Feldman studies in Israel, the parts of their brain in these secondary caretakers, she calls them, because they're
mm,
helping. They're not the primary caretaker, the mother is. Um, it's the frontal cortex, it's the newer parts of their brain.
mm,
It's the parts of the human brain that were co evolving with cooperative breeding, really getting going in the last quarter of the Pleistocene. That's
mm.
when the neocortex really
Yeah.
develops its distinctive shape.
Yep.
And so I've proposed that it co evolve with cooperative breeding. This is when men are making a decision: who else is around who'll help if I don't? How much
Mm,
help is needed?
mm,
What's it going to cost me? What's my condition? Do I want to do this? Do I not? They're making a social judgment about whether or not they should help.
hmm
And so this is a different thing, and they're using this to also read the emotions of their child, and the child is, of course, reading their responsiveness. They're very concerned about who cares for me and who doesn't,
hmm
and this is incorporated into their internal working model. Is the world a good place? Does it have to be the genetic father who does that? No.
mm,
I think babies are very, very forgiving in that respect. I think that window you identified, I don't know how discreet it is for attachment figures, but it's very open ended.
mm,
And even though babies at birth may be looking for two eyes that look like, and maybe there's some evidence that they prefer, quote, pretty or feminine faces to male faces.
mm,
But if a man is the one responding to them and the one who comforts them, they'll love him just as much. And he doesn't have to be their genetic father. So the role of fathers through time as children are growing up, we have a lot of good information on that for humans, both in fiction and autobiographies and in science. But we don't have good animal behavior evidence for that.
mm.
Um, what happens between a man and a male, a progenitor, and his offspring later on? It's just a big black box for most species of primates and other animals, which is why in Father Time, I had to make a decision. I mean, it was a good decision because you need your books not to get too long, like Mother Nature. But it was, I looked at men and offspring in the first 1,000 days.
Mm,
So those are babies.
mm.
That's how I'm defining babies for the purposes of that book. And what happens later on? I think maybe Lee Getler's going to write a good book about that soon. But
Mm, mm,
it's not what I did.
yeah, that's nice though. And the final question here, you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, is it's something that I've thought about as well. Um, uh, um, Richard Reeves wrote a great book
Yeah,
a year or two ago of
yeah,
Boys and Men, or I don't remember what the
yeah,
title
yeah.
is, but yeah, it's
Trouble with
great,
boys and men or something. But anyway,
something like that.
everyone
Yeah,
says there's a crisis.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I guess from you, as at present, how do we see this, shifting and evolving of male roles and fatherhood in the 21st century? We have these old stereotypes, kind of what we said about males and females and mothers and fathers in these discrete categories. But how do you see as we progress? We're a quarter of the way through the 21st century, right? How do we see this kind of wider spectrum of fatherhood in the 21st century that's rooted in an understanding of our evolutionary history.
It is. And, even to think this way is pretty novel. I did an Instagram search of the term gender fluidity. It's just very recently. I think it was even first used maybe in the 80s, and now and of course it also has become kind of a live wire for people. And politically, it played a role in the last election, the antagonism to these ideas. So this is going to be something. Going back to Richard Reeves and, holding boys back in school and allowing them to express themselves more. This is all, it's terrific. But I think men would be doing themselves a favor if the men I've talked to who are engaged in this really hands-on infant care find it really satisfying. They find it a source of identity. And if men are feeling they don't have enough meaning in their life, well, quit whining. Go out and care for somebody. But it requires social accommodations. We need flexible jobs. I was just listening on the radio maybe yesterday about how women in Sweden, many of them want to take on more traditional wife roles again and become trad wives and have their husbands work and they stay at home. Well, that's fine, ladies, but they are taking something for granted. They are taking for granted that they will be able to control when and how often they have babies, that they'll have reproductive autonomy. They're taking into account that in Sweden you have extraordinarily good daycare that's affordable and available.
Oh, yeah.
And they're taking into account that they have these legal rights. Being a traditional wife under those circumstances is quite different from being a, quote, traditional wife. And I wonder if they're really thinking that one through. But, go for it, ladies. That's fine. I actually enjoy domestic activities. I love cooking. I love cooking for my family. And I love that Betty Crocker advertisement. Nothing says loving like cooking from the oven. It means so much to me, though, because I know how critical food sharing and sharing meals has been through the course of human evolution.
Of course, yeah. Oh, I think it's a conversation that we're going to keep having in different contexts and within different disciplines. I mean, I think feminism from the 60s till currently, and even before that, but I'm just, kind of in the modern era, has been great. I think it's been great. But as you have more women in the workforce working alongside men, that's, I think maybe not, not that I've read, and not enough people have thought about the other piece of it, which is, well, then that's going to have to put a bit of, I don't want to say pressure, but there's also the other side where, what does that mean for men in the workforce? What does that mean for them in helping out at home? And how does that, as we do have more egalitarian kinds of ways of doing things in society, that is going to change a little bit of how we see the role that men have and what they do. And so I think maybe that's maybe a surprising feature for some people, but I think it's a good one, because I think you can have more chances for people to say, hey, I can do this or I could do this. You have a wider spectrum, both for men and women, which is, I think at the end of the day, just a net positive for people.
I think so too, as long as it is accompanied by changes in our definitions of masculinity and femininity
Yes, I would agree.
Include these, and with a high degree of tolerance for the spectrum that is you refer to, and that is there. And was it Wordsworth who said, "I contain multitudes"? Well, everybody contains multitudes, and we need to acknowledge this. So we need to, without being phony, admire men. For it is a source of status and identity, and that's not really happening yet. And I haven't really read that in we haven't enlisted the power of social selection to foster these changes that I think would benefit everybody and certainly benefit children.
Yeah. No, listen, I fully agree with you on this. We're singing from the same sheet of music here on this. Sarah, this has been such a delight. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. You're generous with your time and your energy and your wisdom. So really, really, really big thanks and giving me the privilege of talking to you about your wonderful work that you've been doing in your most recent book on fathers. So big thanks for coming on and talking with me.
I've really enjoyed your comments and your questions. Thank you.
Okay.